And our next speaker is Dr. Harald Walach. Dr. Walach holds a double PhD in clinical psychology, in history, and theory of science. He has been, until recently, director of the Institute of Transcultural Health Sciences at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Germany, where he also coordinates a postgraduate training program for doctors in complementary medicine and cultural studies. His research interest is in methodology and evaluation of complementary medicine and the impact of conscience. Please welcome Dr. Harald Walach.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to the invitation to Sonja Doy, the president, and the association here. I feel very honored to be able to present some ideas to you around our own research on spiritual experiences and whatever comes of it. And also, I would like to present some maybe theoretical ideas, some historical ideas, and ground the data within a few ideas as to what actually spiritual experiences can tell us or not. And I'm very grateful that he has just given me a very good background for that. So let me see how that works. Okay, this is this. Oh, the big center one. See, let me start with a little introductory quote. It's from a medieval theologian, John Donne of Duns in Scotland. Expertus infallibiliter novit. Whoever has had an experience has infallible knowledge. I find that a very interesting quote. It's actually a quote stemming out of the discussion of epistemology in the Middle Ages, but it is something we seem to have forgotten. Because experience comes to us in two broad areas. One area is the experience we have within. Now, all of you have had that. There is no one, I assume, who has never been in love, I guess, right? Anyone here who has never been in love? I'm glad. And if you think of that very first experience of being in love, you know exactly that it is something you could possibly not have communicated. You didn't even know what it was about, but it was a very clear experience. And it was very clear to you in that very moment, well, this is the person it's pertaining to, and this is what I want, right? So there is such clarity in that experience, and experiences normally come to us through our consciousness. And I'm very glad that Edsel Cardenio pointed out what we think reality is actually something that happens primarily in our experience. Now, the way how science has moved since the Middle Ages has actually only concentrated on the outer part of experience through our senses and through the instruments we have developed to aid our senses, like telescopes, microscopes, immunological assays, and that sort of thing. But it has not created a way of honing this inner sense of experience that spiritual experiences are about. And I think this is actually quite important. And here is another quote to illustrate that. It's from a Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner. He actually directed it to the Christian, but I think it can be directed to everybody. The Christian, he said, or man of the future, will either be a mystic or won't be existing at all. And by that he meant, if we do not go back to the experiential core of religion, or maybe of reality, we will be in trouble, and we actually are, if you look around. So I've used the term experience, and here is one way you can look at it. This is just a proposal of a definition, so I think experience as something that is always cognitive effective. Think about your being in love. It's always affective and cognitive. And it's an insight that is not necessarily categorical. By categorical, I mean something you can put into categories and fix. but you have to express it somehow, so you come up with a word and say, I love you. And at the same moment, you know that this word or this sentence is not sufficient. So you may be sitting down and write some love poems, that type of thing, in order to produce a knowledge of that whole framework that the experience actually taps into. I'm showing you an example of a traditional spiritual experience that comes from Ignatius of Loyola. And I'll read it to you in case you can't read it properly. It's from his autobiography called The Report of the Pilgrim, and he speaks about himself in the third person. So he says, as he was sitting there, his inner mental eyes began to open up, not as if he had seen an apparition, but he was given understanding and insight into many things about the spiritual life, as well as regarding the truths of faith. This was accompanied by such a huge enlightenment that everything appeared in a new light to him. And whatever he understood then cannot be expressed in single detail, although they were many. So although they were many, this is what I mean by categories, okay? Whatever he understood then cannot be expressed in single detail because it's so much in one thing. And only that he received great clarity in his mind. If he sums up all the help and insight he has received from God during the course of his life, and if he gathers all this into one, still he considers this as less than what he received during this singular experience. This event was so impressive that his mind stayed completely enlightened, and it appeared to him that he has become a wholly different person, and that he has received a different mind to the one he has had previously. So this is the core experience. Ignatius actually had a couple, but that's the core experience that later drove him into whatever he did, founding the Jesuit order, bringing the Counter-Reformation in stage, and one can think about that in different terms historically, judging it, but it was certainly effective. So you see here, experience, a real experience, also has a motivational, action-driven type of aspect. Now, people normally say, well, this is old, and is it really important to us today? I think it is, and I give you an example, which is a modern example. It's a so-called Kensho report. That's a report that people who train in the Zen tradition, when they have such an experience, they are they're required by their teachers to write it down just for, archival purposes. And I asked my own teacher to give me one just to present to you. So this is an anonymous but current person, and he writes his report starting with this. And he said, I had a spontaneous experience once when I was about 8 years old. You heard from Ethel Cardenia that children do have those experiences, so this was one of those. I was herding the cattle of my uncle and sat by them on the paddock when I was suddenly shone through. The cows, the paddock, the light of the summer, I myself, we all were one. And the cows appeared to me as if they were the most beautiful beings on earth. This unity with the cows was such that I refused to use a stick to herd them. They were following me just as well. I understood intuitively, or at least thought I did, why people in India hold cows holy. This experience of unity with those animals and with nature in general has remained present with me ever since. Now, this is a spontaneous experience that happened when this person was 8 years old. And later on, through retreat, he had another one which he reports here. Suddenly, it appeared as if a door opened. Reality broke asunder, or to be more precise, it did not break, but it was as if a curtain was drawn apart. The very same reality showed itself in a completely different light, as it were, and it was clear as the sun, in the truest sense of the word. For at the same time I saw a miraculously bright light, which was as bright as the sun, but still did not blind me. It made everything appear clearly. It was clear as the sun that this is exactly the reality, and at the same time separated from us by a wall of paper, although it is not separated. In Zen terminology, it was the true being, and I am identical with it. Within me and within everything else there lives the very same light, and I am it, completely identical with it. An incredible wave of joy never experienced before or after literally washed me from the path I was walking on. And I knew this reality is reality itself. It is always there, only we do not see it. Suddenly I understood a lot, with an understanding that is happening as it were in a huge lightening of the now, and whose explication is still ongoing. So here you have a very interesting example of insight coming in one moment that is being explicated. That's why I say it's not something that you can put into categories easily. So when such experiences are interpreted within the framework of a religion, we call it a religious experience. But very often people have these experiences spontaneously, and then we would call it a spiritual experience. And my guess is that depending on the cultural framework and depending on the time you are having that in and the family you're living in, you may interpret it this way or that way, and perhaps the core is always the same. We don't know that, so I just suggest that this might be the case. I said it is not easily interpretable in categories. That's why I say it is originally polyvalent, right? Polyvalent meaning you can't say it's this or it's that. It's many things. And this is the reason why religious texts normally use metaphors, paradoxes, paradoxical stories, even to make understood how complex this experience and the reality is. The only really scientific approach to that I found in Helmut Reich's book, Developing the Horizons of the Mind, which is very interesting because he did empirical studies with young people, adolescents, giving them problems to solve, moral problems, and he studied their way of thinking, and he discovered that after the 5 stages that Piaget had introduced, and the end of the ladder there is the rational thinking, which is the normal way we produce insight, comes another one, which he calls relational, contextual, or complementaristic reasoning. And this is akin to what I have in mind. So there needs to be a different way of thinking. And here is an illustration for that. So this is what I use to illustrate complementarity. It's one of those teasing pictures which you can see in this or in that way. So you can, for instance, see a young lady when you interpret that as a chin, and this as an ear, and this as a necklace, and then she's looking into that direction. These are the eyelashes. Or you can interpret that as an old woman, and then you would interpret that as a chin, this as a mouth, this as a nose, and this as an eye, right? So, and as you can see, 2 things that are seemingly contradictory in one image, those experiences are always multivalent. They have not just one meaning. So my proposed definition of spirituality here is a habit of being oriented towards or searching for or expressing a reality that transcends immediate personal, individual needs and interests. And it always has 3 dimensions, cognitive, at least 3 dimensions. Cognitive, understanding, you saw that in the examples. Emotional, you saw that also in the examples. And pragmatic, action or motivation. So if you are in love with someone, you have the motivation of meeting this person, or even marrying her or him. And I would like to give you 3 propositions here. I think spirituality is actually a human condition, similar to sexuality, something everybody has to some extent. I mean, there are people who are seemingly asexual, or they are not interested in sex. They go into monastic orders and have no problems. And there are people who are sex hungry, and they have to have 5 intercourses a day in order to feel alive, okay? And in the same continuum, you probably also have spirituality as something that is human, and some people have more of it or are more interested in it, and others are less interested in it. And I think it's probably the core of all religious systems. That's a very complicated question. I don't want to go into that because there is a big debate in the in the theory of religion about that. But I think it's a reasonable proposal to start from that. And the most important thing for us here is, I think spirituality is actually the biggest taboo in science of our days. It's not so much a taboo for normal people, but for the scientific discourse, for the scientific debate. And this is the reason why we are sitting here in a comparatively small audience discussing that, and we are not sitting in the Academy of Science discussing this issue there. You wouldn't find a group doing that there. This little graph is supposed to give you a kind of summary of how that can connect. I think experience is always primary here. But experience, even though it may happen out of time and context, always has to go back into a cultural and historical context. So the spiritual experience, thank you, the spiritual experience that the historical Jesus had in a time of Roman occupation of Palestine would have been different to the experience a modern Christian person would have, or Jewish person for that matter, who sits in a Zen retreat in the 20th century, although the experience itself might be the same. But the context is different. So, and this context is normally framed through language, through political situations, and it informs religion. So this spiritual experience moves into the context, joins up with whatever is there in terms of cultural vessels or cultural expressions, rituals, and if that overlaps, we call it religiosity. I've drawn that overlap very small here because I think that is what happens in our modern day time, but it could also be a very big overlap, okay? And what is also important is out of that come attitudes, behavior, ethics, morality. We nowadays are in a situation where ethics and morality are kind of isolated from that context, right? So we have actually problems fixing it. And we think maybe legal fixations might help, but they don't, as you can see. I think what we need in order to also secure ethics and behavior is reconnect with that context here. And another way of looking at it is the following. Spirituality actually often comes out of spiritual practice. The historical Jesus in the Gospels prayed and fasted, spiritual practice. Monks and shamans did rituals in order to produce these experiences. So there is always some spiritual practice starting with it, which has some physiological effects, but also epistemological and cognitive effects when people have this experience. That moves through a cultural framework and produces somehow religion. But this is also a way that moves back because religion also forms a cultural framework which also impacts on the experience, which also impacts on spiritual practice. So it doesn't make sense to separate one from the other. And that makes it so complicated because these experiences, they always come within a complex context. Spiritual experiences are natural, which you can see in that slide. That reports a study we did a couple of years ago, and it was an actually representative survey of all German psychotherapists. We tried very, very hard to get a representative sample, and I think we succeeded. We asked these people, do you believe in a higher reality? And I was very surprised to see that two-thirds actually do believe in a higher reality. This is psychologists who have undergone a very secular training in a German university, and there is no talk about that at all, nowhere. So there is no training or no background information on that. Yet there is still this belief here. And we also asked them about what they said they call themselves. And you see, again, about two-thirds call themselves spiritual religious or spiritual and religious, and then there is a third of people who are either atheist or agnostic or don't know what they are. That's very typical for psychologists, I find. And then we ask them, have you had a spiritual experience yourself? And again, we were very surprised to learn that only a third said, no, we have never had that. So probably, if you ask people on the street and did that survey on normal people, you'd probably find 2/3 of the people would have had some spiritual experience. That replicates an American study, by the way, which Harald Walach did a couple of years earlier in New Zealand, Canada, and US. And he found pretty similar data, as you can see from there. There is a little bit, there's a little bit larger group of people who are high in both individual spirituality and traditional religiosity, which is probably true for America, but the rest looks pretty similar. So here comes the question: if spirituality is so natural, why is it not a common topic? Why is it actually dangerous to academic careers? And it is, I've seen that, to pursue that topic. And why is the academic literature comparatively scant? There is some studies around, but not very many. And why is it not a public discourse? I'm not giving you the answer right away, and you can think about that. Maybe we find the answer together, but I find these questions natural. If spirituality is so common, why does not everybody study it? Sex has been studied for ages in thousands of papers and books. I think Enlightenment history is one of the reasons, because the history of scholarship and of science was always connected to the Enlightenment movement. That is a good thing, don't get me wrong. I think Enlightenment is a huge achievement of our Western culture, and we should not belittle it, not at all. But during that course, Enlightenment freed itself from the religious bondages, as it were, freed itself from dogma, from intellectually not understandable prescriptions and that sort of thing, and by that moved the whole topic of religion out of the scope of science proper. And with religion, spirituality has been discarded as well. And what happened was that a materialist worldview has become predominant in the scientific world. Not as a reflected thing that people say, we are materialists because this is how the world is, but because the history has made it this way. So it's actually more like a background theory that most scientists hold, and the background theory they don't even reflect upon. They think this is clear, isn't it? We don't have to discuss that because everybody knows it, don't we? That type of thing, okay? And so rationalism, since the time of scientific enlightenment, has proceeded to produce this materialist worldview, which I call crypto-materialistic because it's so unconscious. And so science has produced an understanding that the world has to be understood in terms of material outer reality only. And this is the problem we are facing. The foundations were laid by Descartes when his posthumous treatment, Traité de l'Homme, was published, and this filled with images like that, where he tries to understand, make understood how the body works purely mechanistically. And we have to get that right here. When Descartes published that, or actually it was published after his death, but when Descartes conceived of these ideas, they were absolutely modern. They were absolutely stunning. Nobody thought in those categories. And it's easy to understand how Descartes reached that idea. You know, when you look at watches and clocks and all those miracles that mechanistic craftsmen could produce, or water games, that sort of thing. These things look natural, didn't they? So why not turn the thought around and think about the body as being a machine? And that is what Descartes did. It took about 200 years until this idea was actually mainstream. It came into the mainstream in the 19th century with Virchow and his cellular pathology in around 1848, 1850, and then it was gradually accepted. It took 200 years for that thought to be accepted, and now it's mainstream, and it has produced the background for a magnificent understanding of the body, for a very, very powerful medical intervention technology that helps us with all emergency medical problems. You know, if I had a cardiac arrest, I'd rather be in the hands like Pim van Lommel, you know, cardiologists who have learned their business, understand the body as a machine, then go to a shaman who tries to pray with me for 4 hours. But if I have a really serious chronic problem, I'm not so sure I would do that. But what I'm saying is, this is a very, very interesting abstraction that had produced very good understanding of the body and a particular type of medicine that is very effective in curing acute problems. But it also has transported this implicit ontology of materialism as an implicit ontology of science, because it has also extended this thought to the mind. Descartes, you know, separated these two things, mind and matter. But the pace of history has actually subtly converted the intention of Descartes and used the thought of mechanization in order to also mechanize the mind. And now we think we understand how the mind works because we know how neurons work. I think we are far from understanding how the mind works, but this is the idea that comes out of that thinking, okay? And here is a perfection of that idea. It comes from Fritz Kahn, a very interesting poster he produced for an exhibition in Düsseldorf in 1926, and it's overscribed as Man as Industrial Palace, the Mensch als Industriepalast in German. Here you can see how he conceived of the body as a machine, the stomach that gets everything through, mouth and the lungs and everything, like a factory, yeah? Perfected in the 20th century. These data are quite interesting to show you that Enlightenment has actually done its work completely well. This is a survey of scientists from the Academy of Science in the US, and these are the top-ranking ones, right? Those that sit in the funding bodies, those that make decisions where science should go. And they were surveyed and asked, do you believe in God? And as you can see here, most don't. Most are not active non-believer, and some are agnostics. They say, well, we don't bother and we don't know. But most say, no, I don't believe and I know it's true. And only very few believe in an afterlife. Yeah, 7%. Most of those who believe are mathematicians and physicists, and most of those who don't, and very few are biologists and psychologists and the rest of it. So you see, Enlightenment has completed its business with scientists. Now let me go into some data which we produced. This is from one study we did a couple of years ago, where we studied spiritual experiences, constructing that questionnaire, exceptional experiences questionnaire, and used it together with a psychiatric scale, the short symptom checklist 90, with roughly 700, 800 people, spiritual practicing ones, normal population, and some clinical population. That questionnaire is pretty comprehensive. It's also quite reliable. It has a very good retest reliability after 6 months, so you can use it quite well, I think. And it measures 4 different scales: positive spiritual experiences, negative spiritual experiences, psychopathological ones, and visionary and dream experiences. Looks like that. So, for instance, this is an item that goes into the visionary scale. I have strange and peculiar dreams. My environment seems absurd or exaggerated, distorted to me sometime. A feeling of ignorance or not knowing is overwhelming me. These are all items that load on this or on that. Mental powers inspire me at work. That's a positive spiritual item, loading on that. I dream of future events which later happen, loading on visionary and dream experiences. So we used that scale together with the stress scale and did a structural equation modeling. And what we find is very interesting. Spiritual experiences correlate negatively with stress with a brief symptom index of that scale, and ego dissolution and psychopathology, they correlate positively, which you would expect. But the interesting thing is you can separate them, okay? Here is the model. Don't be afraid, I'll explain it to you. So this is stress, and we're trying to explain stress through those 4 factors. They are all interrelated. I've left that out. And those are path coefficients. So these are correlation coefficients that explain those 28% of the variance in that stress measurement. Okay, so what you see is positive spiritual experiences, they load negatively, so they reduce stress. Negative spiritual experiences, they load positively, they increase stress. Psychopathological experiences, they also increase stress. And visionary experiences, they don't do much. They are not related to stress. This was the spiritual practicing group, okay? Now watch this one. This is the not practicing group. And here you find something very interesting. The scale, this scale explains much more variance, namely 53% of the variance, and that's quite a big amount of variance explained in psychological terms, okay? What you see is that positive spiritual experiences, they buffer stress better, but more importantly, negative spiritual experiences, they increase stress, as do psychopathological experiences. I go back again so you can see that and compare it. So what actually happens is that spiritual practice reduces this whole thing, okay? Whereas people with no spiritual practice, for them spiritual experiences, and especially the negative spiritual experiences, they are much more important, and the explanation is much bigger. What is the conclusion for that? The lesson learned is a lack of spiritual practice is actually a risk factor for mental health, I find. And by spiritual practice, we mean anything. Any regular practice. It could be meditation, could be Tai Chi, could be contemplation, could be rosary prayer every day, whatever. Anything that is regular spiritual practice. Why is that so? We're not quite sure, but I think what happens is that spiritual practice kind of produces a framework that allows people to understand those dissolution experiences that everybody has. The world breaks apart, you know, or I don't know where I stand, or I don't know what I should believe in. Those experiences everybody has. But spiritual practice seems to either counteract them by positive experiences or produces a framework where people can actually use these experiences in a constructive way. This is data from David Orme Johnson, Transcendental Meditators, which I find interesting because he shows there that they experience less pain. That was an fMRI study, so people were in a scanner, and they had to experience a heat shock kind of pain stimulus, and measurements were before and after. And if you look at those ones, if you look at those ones, these are the experienced meditators. They don't change at all, right? These ones, they don't change at all. Whereas people without meditation experience, they show big changes in the thalamus, in the prefrontal cortex, in the total brain, in the cingulum. And after a while, when they meditate, these control people, they have the same effect. So what you can actually see is meditators seem to be able to distance themselves from that pain stimulus and regulate their pain better. Why that is so, we don't know, but probably meditation changed just the brain structure, which we can see in that meta-analysis that has recently been published. It's a meta-analysis of all 21 studies that have been done with roughly 300 people, long-term meditators compared to controls, but also novices after meditation training. And these are the areas where you can see changes. The blue ones are gray matter changes, and the red ones are white matter changes. So what you can see is that the corpus callosum, that tract that connects the two brain hemispheres, is stronger in meditators. What you can also see is that this tract that connects the frontal and the parietal areas is stronger, but you can also see changes in the gray matter, so the insular cortex that monitors both our physical conditions in the body, but is also very important for producing consciousness, is changed. The rostral left prefrontal cortex, which is supposedly involved in emotion regulation, is changed. The cingulate cortex, which is involved in all sorts of attention controls and also emotional regulation, is changed. We see changes in the motor cortices, but maybe most importantly in the hippocampus, which is the area that is involved in memory consolidation, emotional control. And we do have some data that people who meditate regularly have less cognitive decline over the ages. So might be even an Alzheimer prevention strategy just for those of you who are approaching the 60s, right? Here is the second study, which we did in England a couple of years ago, together with George Lewis in his practice at an integrative clinic, where he treated chronic patients. And we had patients with chronic fatigue, migraine, irritable bowel syndromes. And we just gave them 2 questionnaires, namely the Spiritual Experiences questionnaire, which you just saw, and the Mindfulness questionnaire, which we have developed a couple of years ago. Interestingly, we see that 54% have a regular spiritual practice. That was quite amazing to see. And now, if we try to understand how spiritual practice explains mental stress, what we see is, again, that this factor 2, the ego loss factor, is the strongest predictor. Yeah? This is a correlation coefficient that could be between -1 and +1. And this is highly significant, explains nearly 40% of the variance, only that factor. Now, if you include mindfulness, you can see in the next model, you can see variance is explained is stronger, and the effect is negative. So the higher mindfulness is, the lower is the mental stress. Now, interestingly enough, is that if you enter the interaction between mindfulness and ego loss, so this second factor, you get even a higher explanation, which means what apparently happens is that people who meditate and are more mindful, they have a better way of dealing with these deconstructive experiences that everybody has. And this together explains quite a lot of the variance in mental stress. So spiritual experiences and spiritual practice seem to interact in order to buffer that stress that people have. This is one of my favorite studies here. That was a study where psychotherapists in training were randomized to either receive an hour's SOTO-SEN training in the morning before they started work, or they didn't, and measured were the patients after about 6 weeks. So this is a German psychotherapy clinic where psychotherapists receive their training and patients are being treated. And what you see here is that patients that were treated by therapists that meditated had about 3 times the effect measured in the global severity index of the SL90 again, against control patients. They were all better off in the end. But the patients who were treated by meditating practitioners had a much higher effect, which is probably due to the fact that the meditation allowed these therapists to be better connected with whatever their patients needed. Shortly, I would like to introduce a small project we did in Frankfurt in Germany, Mindful School. These are 3rd graders meditating in school. That was done by 2 of my PhD students. We tried to introduce that. It is actually very complicated to introduce that in the German system, and we haven't quite succeeded in getting it fully integrated. Part of that was a meta-analysis of all studies that are around, which I would like to shortly point out to you. We retrieved all published, but also the unpublished studies. Published that briefly, here you see that. Published that in Frontiers in Psychology a couple of years ago. And what we see is that even in children, although the measures are not very good, we have a comparatively good result, a medium effect size of the meditation training. This is within groups, and this is when you look at groups that have comparison groups. And interestingly enough, the effect is strongest in cognitive performance. So to some extent, you see this is the effect size. It's 0.80 for the controlled studies and 0.70 for the uncontrolled studies or pre-post measurements. So meditation makes children smart, actually. One should sell that, I find, to educators. I skipped that. So this was some empirical data. For the last 5 minutes, join me in a few theoretical ideas here. The problem which we have is this implicit materialistic ontology, I have said. If that is true, then whatever spiritual experiences teach us can only be looked at from the psychiatric option. Then you have a hallucination, because the brain is just idling, okay? So in that sense, spiritual experiences can have nothing to do with reality in the mainstream scientific view. So what needs to happen to change that? Because if experience is viewed exclusively in terms of an extended sense experience of the world, then spiritual experiences, which are inner experiences, can have no reference out there, and that is the problem. I skipped that. So what needs to happen? I think what needs to happen is we need to actually question the materialist dogma, especially regarding the ontological status of consciousness. I think there have been a couple of proposals here, so what we actually need is a viable, non-reductionist solution to the mind-body problem. That is necessary, and we don't have that. But we also need to work on the epistemology of inner experience. So how can we actually ground inner experience and derive knowledge from it? For scientific purposes, I think it's enough to document the phenomenology for the time being and the impact and consequences of spirituality on people's lives. But for epistemology, it's not the same. It's not enough. Here is one proposal how to solve the mind-body problem in a phenomenologically dualistic but ontologically monistic way. That actually comes from Spinoza, Leibniz, and others, and it would look like that. So there is one reality. Jung called that unus mundus, unity of matter and mind. That is phenomenologically split in two realities, matter and mind. And we have two types of epistemologies: external experience that deals with matter, and inner experiences that deal with the mind. What we need is some connecting principle, and we've produced some of the ideas which are too complicated to go into here in those publications here. And what we also need is an epistemology of inner experience. We've produced a couple of ideas in those papers. So what we need is perhaps move from first-person accounts like "I have seen this" to a first-person plural account. Many people have seen this, and they agree in that, and that is something that you can find in the tradition. We need ways to discriminate valid experiences from hallucination, and maybe pragmatic tests would be one of the options. So it's always the pragmatic effect in the world that distinguishes valid from invalid experiences. And we probably need to separate the experience and the phenomenology from the religious or ideological interpretation. Many people don't do that. That is a very important step, I find. To end, I think spirituality is really a valuable and a dignified topic which we should move forward, a source of insight and inspiration even for scientists. So I would think a group of meditating scientists would produce better ideas for research than people who are just hunt for money, right? What needs to be explored is spiritual experiences as a source for insight into meaning and values, because it also helps us to understand the fabric of our lives individually and collectively, and that is where values come from. And so the vision would be that we develop a methodology that complements the exterior approach that science has developed by an interior approach of epistemology. And whoever wants to read more about that, I've written that together in that book, Secular Spirituality. I brought one copy for inspection out there because it's a bit expensive. And I can also send you some papers if you write an email to me. So thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walach. I would like to invite Dr. Cardenio back to the stage. We have some time now for a couple questions from the audience. So please go ahead to the microphone in the center to address your questions to Dr. Walach or Dr. Cardenio. Thank you.
No, but I'll start actually because I think a lot of the things that Harald said are just very consistent.
Please, the microphone.
What I was doing. So it is a nice compliment because when I was talking about there is no relation between pathology and having anomalous experiences in your own research, you did not stress that, but in the data you have exactly that. There's absolutely no relation. And the other point that I wanted to make is that the other issue that I think we need to do is to regain the real historical account of what happened in Enlightenment and later on. Because we get the notion, well, Newton and Leibniz and Enlightenment was just anti-religious and or anti-spiritual and secular, and that was not the case. There were a number of figures, the same as now, who were very much pro-spiritual, Newton, Leibniz, later on Einstein, and so on. It's just that those interests by the historians have been put underground, and with the kind of account has been a very impoverished account that assumes, oh, well, these intelligent people do not have those kinds of experiences and interests, so therefore these intelligent people could not have had them, even though they did. So it is good to remind them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me just add something to that. I think this is actually a very recent phenomenon, that science phenomenology, science and enlightenment couples with a materialist view of the world is probably only 100 years old, that idea.
Seems like we have a question for the audience. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. This question is for Dr. Walach. It's sort of a two-part question. The first is, when you were doing your research on the positive effects of regular spiritual practice, did you control for other factors like exercise? And I'm wondering whether there are any other activities which can bring on the same positive effects that a regular spiritual practice does for the things that you're talking about, you know, these deregulations that we experience in life, these losses of ego, like exercise, or is there something unique to spiritual practice that helps us cope with these things? Thank you.
No, we didn't. I mean, this was a very humble study, you know. We just tried to validate our questionnaire, and we wanted to see how spiritually practicing and non-practicing people differentiate in those areas. And for further research, that would be, of course, very interesting to distinguish whether exercise that is combined with practice, such as yoga, and exercise that isn't, such as Zen or contemplation, show different effects. And the resolution of our study wasn't big enough for that, but that would be a next step. Thank you for that idea.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Walach. I was just wondering, what degree of, is there some interest among German scientists in the work and legacy of Bruno Gröning?
Sorry for laughing. The short answer is no, and I can explain it to you why. Bruno, for those do everybody know who Bruno Gröning is? No? Bruno Gröning was a very famous German healer who came out of the war a little bit damaged, one would say, and then he set up a healing practice. He was, I think, a carpenter or something like that by his first training. And he had masses of people actually going to him in a pilgrimage, and he was very, very famous. But in fact, he was probably really a quack. But still, people believe in him, and there are still groups of Bruno Gröning followers who have their meetings, and I had one of those meetings, not of the meetings, but of the people at my university, and they explained the cases, and they're actually miraculous cases there. I would agree with that, you know, but I wouldn't be able to understand how that would be connected to that historical person, Bruno Gröning, who was probably a very strange guy. So, and that is the reason why German scientists are not at all interested. A colleague of mine who is a historian, he did a study, and he left no hair on his head in this study.
We'll take now the final question.
Thank you both for your wonderful talks. Really appreciate the work you're doing. I've been extremely interested in a term called spiritual emergency, and looking really at the notion that Dr. Walach, you brought up around mystical experience assisting us. If anything is going to help us move into a sustainable planetary civilization, it might be mystical experience and people moving into oneness. So along that order, it seems in the United States there's a subculture which is really exploring psychedelics to move into that state of oneness. And I'm aware as a psychologist that there are a lot of people who are exploring through psychedelics who are actually running into some real problems. However, there's also some excellent psychotherapy that is, especially I think in Europe, being used to assist people to have possibly mystical experience, but certainly a non-egoic kind of experience that is moving them into higher states of consciousness. So I'm wondering about if you would comment a little bit more on using a discipline such as spiritual practice versus using a psychedelic experience, especially as it's being used right now outside of a setting like psychotherapy. In other words, the dangers of it. Excuse me?
Do you want me to comment on that, both of us?
Well, I'd love it if you'd both comment on it, but you were the one who talked about mystical experience being so important to us right now.
Well, maybe I can say a few words on that. I agree there is a big group of people who try to go the short road, I would call it, you know, taking drugs or taking psychedelics to move into that experience. I don't want to belittle that because I don't have hands-on experience myself, so I don't know about that. I've had one guy sitting in my office who was completely deranged after having eaten some mushrooms, and he was in a terrible state, and I'm not saying this is the common one, but that's a danger. And I think spiritual traditions always knew about that danger, and that is why they have very strict regimens to hone these experiences, to ground them, and to also make them fruitful. So psychotherapies, I know, I mean, those holistic breathing techniques are very powerful, and they may be able to speed up those processes, but in the end, I think there is no short or high road to enlightenment in the sense of not having a regular practice. I think that's really key.
Yeah. Basically in agreement, but I would of course question, and I think you will agree with me, that you can get a completely deranged person after a political rally. So it is not necessarily a matter of drugs, you know, all kinds of things can produce. But the point, and I like what Harald was saying, is that you need to become pragmatic after having a spiritual experience. And you can have some extraordinary experiences, and then after you felt one with everything, just become the regular bastard you were before the following day. No, I think it has happened to most people, not to all. And then we also have people like Richard Feynman and Charlie Tart and so on, who have done work with people who had the original, let's say, the initial extraordinary experience, and then went into meditation or becoming pragmatically engaged in helping the environment and so on, and ended up translating an extraordinary mystical experience into a pragmatically helpful and humanitarian style of life, which is what we need.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your questions. It's so enriching when the audience participates, so I appreciate the people that came ask questions. Now we are going to have a coffee break. It will be a 30-minute break. Coffee and snacks are available upstairs in the lobby. They are free of charge, but we kind of ask for your donation to help defray the cost of this event. There is also a need for you to be back here at 10:30. Thank you.